Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Premier Pundits podcast. Of course, I'm joined by the fantasy doc himself, Raj, from 3CB Performance. It's been another busy week, Raj. How are you, my friend?
I'm good. How about yourself?
I'm very cold. I'm a lot cooler, I suspect, than you are. In northeast of England, it has been snowing for the last 2 to 3 days, and we're currently at around -2 to 3, and the temperature gauge is falling even further this evening.
Oh, in Southern California, it has not been snowing. So,
Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting the invite, Raj, to come.
once the saw clears up.
The business. Lots
Correct.
to talk about, lots to happen. Last week's podcast, we touched upon the accumulation of fatigue, which was reflected in the increase in number of muscular problems. Now, I'm going to talk about a team obviously close to your heart, with Arsenal, and we've seen Thomas Partey limp off again at the weekend. Arsenal supporters quite rightly concerned, given the player's injury problems or issues that since he's joined the club. I mean, is that a concern for you? Maybe in the long term, that Partey's picking up these niggles and muscular problems during the early part of his Arsenal career.
I think it certainly is, but not entirely unexpected because we always talk about the increase in intensity when it comes to these Premier League games week in and week out versus in La Liga. You can kind of ebb and flow a little more depending on your competition, but it's always concerning to see multiple muscle injuries in close succession because you can enter that re-injury cycle where not only do you have the injury, but then now you're losing your overall fitness, which can then lead to increased risk. The good news here is, as you touched on, that this doesn't seem to be a overt injury and he might actually be okay to play this weekend. So perhaps it was just some sort of cramping or some just very precautionary measure.
Yeah. So good news on that front. I wanted, that fits nicely into also we haven't seen Kieran Tierney much in recent weeks. Now the official updates from the club suggest that there's a little bit of tightness in the calf, there's a problem in that lower leg, and yet he hasn't been near that first team. Are you able to sort of shed any light as to where we might be and the possibility of Tierney returning anytime soon?
Yeah, the Tierney one is a tough conundrum because manager Miguel Arteta touched on this as well, is that he's a player who's always pushing to go 100%. When he's on the pitch, he doesn't take any minute off. He's always going. So as a training and coaching staff, you have to consider that, where for a player who maybe is able to turn that switch a little bit, you might allow him to come back sooner. But with Tierney, he might get into that red zone much quicker once you put him onto the pitch. And so that's going to be a very, very gray area, constant assessment. We're trying to figure out, okay, can he handle that intensity? And then the question becomes, does doing things off the pitch actually prepare you for that in-game intensity, right? That's really the hard part here with Tierney.
Yeah, because certainly, I mean, we all know about the Premier League and the exertions and the most dynamic league in the world, not just in terms of maybe distance covered, but those number of high intensity sprints. And my concern or my worry would be, how are you ever going to get Tierney into a place where he's able to tolerate the demands of the game? Would that be a case of being maybe that gradual introduction back into the first team, maybe, like I say, not maybe put on from the start, or if he is on from the start, you're maybe looking at that 50 to 60 minute mark before then you're looking at making a change?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I would imagine that they will go with. That's my guess with what they were doing with Partey as well during the North London Derby when he got re-injured beforehand, where you introduce them gradually back in for that 50 to 60. In Tierney's case, if they're really concerned, potentially doing it on the back end of a game for 15 to 20 minutes and seeing how he responds to it. It all just depends on how much fatigue they're seeing, what he's capable of tolerating right now.
Yeah. And of course, I think what always helps is when you have an upturn in performance, which is reflected in results, and we've seen Cedric who's come in and he's done a good job, then the pressure, that alleviates the problem on Mikel Arteta, and the decision maybe to leave Kieran Tierney out of that match day squad becomes a lot simpler.
Absolutely. It always helps to have decent cover behind you. And like you said, not have that overt pressure to play a player.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, there's also a couple of high-profile discussion points from this weekend, both regarding knee injuries or one recovering. They had been. I've noticed a distinct shift in the terminology being used by managers in recent press conferences, namely Chris Wilder at Sheffield United and also Nuno Espirito Santo at Wolves. They've never been the most open of characters when it comes to team news, and not very forthcoming, which is understandable. But in the last couple, they've actually just come out and categorically said, "I'm not telling you, about what's happening on the team. I will leave it until team sheets are submitted on that match day." So it came as quite a big surprise that Jonny Otto Castro was included not only in the Wolves match day squad, but also the starting 11. Now, we're talking about a guy who suffered, obviously, quite a serious knee injury, an ACL rupture, almost 6 months to the day. We were aware of the fact that he was back on the training pitches with the first team, but to be thrown back into the first team environment, starting 11, a big game against Leicester. I mean, as a frontline practitioner, as a clinician, did that come as a little bit of a surprise to you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we know with the research, it shows that with these expedited return to play protocols, which are considered less than 9 months, there are significantly higher chances for re-injury to the ACL, injury to the other knee, and injury all along that lower body because you have compensation. And so not just that, but then like you said, taking him straight into the starting 11 and having that jump in intensity in a big match, which is even higher intensity. I mean, there's some definite risk there, mate. So I'm very surprised.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you factor in the injuries to Ait Nouri, Mark Carl, who had played on that left-hand side. Roman Sias had also been, sidelined for a little bit. I mean, what I hasten to add, over the last maybe, this season aside, for the first 2 seasons that Wolves have come into the Premier League, I mean, their injury record has surpassed, and like anything we've seen since we started collecting data. So they've obviously got a well-placed, well-managed medical team in there, and that was a calculated list. And he looks as if he come through that opening 45 minutes. Now, would you expect, in terms of a recovery after that 45 minutes, would you expect now Jonny to sort of kick on and maybe those minutes to be increased over time? Or we've seen Sias back on the bench. Do you think there might be a little bit of flip-flopping between the two? And how long before we've had a return to play would you expect maybe Jonny to have a return to performance and go back to those levels that we've seen pre-injury?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the assessment. When they would assess him after the match. They'll see how he feels today, how much discomfort, how much soreness he's having. They'll take him through the testing. So it really comes down to that. Generally, I'd imagine after a 6-month return, they'll still try to have some of that flip flop and give him some time to acclimate fully back to the 90. And so when it comes to return to performance, I would imagine, considering how much time is left, by the end of the season, you might start to see some of that return closer to return to performance. But truly, I would say start of next season.
So if he's sort of registered on the FPL radar and he returns to play, maybe his managers need to temper that little bit of enthusiasm and just watch it and wait for a little bit until he sort of plays himself back into the game.
Yeah, but at the same time, like you said, with the Wolves, they do have a very good track record. And so they might have some different calculations and assessments that they're doing that give them more insight into it. So again, I mean, just generally speaking, I would imagine they're still going to reacclimate him. And one of the key things we know following ACL injury is the mental part. The kinesiophobia, fear of injury, fear of movement can still come into play. One of the last things to overcome. So that's something I always try to pay attention to with players. Are they going into the 50-50 challenges as effectively as they were before?
Yeah. And finally, Raj, I mean, we touched upon your team. I'm going to stay close to home for me as well, because Newcastle, we've got a cracking result at the weekend, probably against all odds, given that we finished the game with 9 men. One of the biggest concerns coming out of that match was the loss of Fabian Schar to what looks like quite a serious knee problem. Now he's came out on social media and he said, look, I was feeling great. Unfortunately, it looks like I'm going to be out for a 3 month or a few months. Are you able to sort of shed any light on from what you've seen or heard as to the possibility of what's going on there?
Yeah, not much information here. I think based on what we saw in the video, although not clear, it looked to be, my first thought was an MCL injury, medial collateral ligament, possibly some PCL with the way it was pushed back. But, that would line up with what he's saying, 2 months. I always take what a player says with a grain of salt. They don't quite understand a lot of those nuances. But just based on that, him saying he wants to be ready for the Euros, I think mid-level MCL tear or something of that nature was what my mind went to first.
Yeah, so we're probably thinking maybe in the region of a grade 2, but and unlikely, if his timeline is to be believed, that will not require a surgical intervention.
Yeah, I would not expect that, considering with that timeline, especially if he's trying to get back for Euros. I don't think so.
Mm-hmm. And realistic as well, and from what you know as to be back, because as a national team coach, I would want, and I know he is a high status player within the national team, but there's 2 schools of thought here. We have Steve Bruce, who would say, we'll keep Fabian Schar. We want him safe. We want to keep him for 21, 22. Give him a full summer of recovery. But as a national team coach, will he want him playing competitive football, before he makes that decision on whether to include him in the Euros?
It really depends on what the injury is. But like you said, he's such a key part of the team that an international coach might take him on anyways. And if it is truly an MCL injury, I always tell people, if there's one ligament you want to injure, it's the MCL, because it heals really, really effectively, has a great blood supply. And so if that is the true injury, it's really not all that concerning to me. What might concern me if there is some PCL or LCL damage.
Yeah, brilliant, Raj. That's just what I wanted to hear. I mean, it's not going to help Newcastle this weekend, where we're a little bit short in defence, but certainly for the long term, it looks good for Newcastle, and it is for Fabian Schar. Once again, thanks very much. I've really enjoyed it, Raj. Great insight. Fantastic. Make sure you're following the Fantasy Doc. It's Raj Brar at 3CB Performance. But for now, that's all, folks.